world languages. And this is Stephanie Davenport. She's the Department Chair of Social Sciences. And this is a collaboration between our departments. We thought it was kind of interesting, this whole concept of fake news, that we would blend our departments together and have a conversation. We're happy to have Andrew Crocker, who is political science instructor here at OTC. He's going to be our moderator, and so I'm going to turn it over to him. And we're looking to have a good opportunity to have some stimulating conversation.
Thank you very much, Kimberly. What we are doing today, we're talking about the phenomenon of fake news, a cloudy umbrella term that doesn't actually have any one definition. It kind of depends on who you ask or who you talk to. Momentarily, we're going to introduce our panelists here. But before that, I actually want to throw the floor again over to Stephanie, if you want to go.
Okay, guys, we're going to do a little bit of audience participation during the discussion tonight and keep going. So, first thing I want you to do is get out your phones. Get out. Now you got them. Get out. First, pockets. Get out. Once you have them out, please open your text messaging app and open up a new message. Many of you are not going to text me, I promise. Okay. All right, so get open your phones, open a new message. And in that to box, I want you to type 37607. It's in your to box, the recipient, 37607. And what I'll do, I will put up a question on both monitors, and you will respond via your text answer. Okay? So the first question we have for tonight: what is your primary source of news? Is your primary source of news TV, cable, local, night news? Is it online, social media, apps, websites? Is it radio, print newspapers, or none? Whichever one matches, that's what you put in the message box. If I say none, I type this number in the message and hit send. Yes. How about I type in all of them? You must pick one. That's a very good question. What is your primary source of news? So primary. What is your first choice of news? And as we get these results in, we can see the results change. This will guide our discussion.
Sure, yeah, pick it up. Leave it live. All right, so I want to, again, welcome everybody. This is a conversation here at OTC, co-hosted by the OTC Communications Department, by the Social Sciences Department, and also by OTC's student organization, our Political Science Club, Politically Active. What we are talking about today is fake news, and before we begin that conversation, I would allow each of our panelists, and we'll start with Alissa right here, to introduce themselves and to the crowd.
Hi, my name is Alissa, and I cover local politics for the Springfield News Leader. I noticed that newspapers is one of the smallest categories up there. Maybe there's a reason that profits are dropping, but we're always branching out into digital and trying to find a larger audience, especially amongst the youths, as we call them. And I cover city council, so Councilman Schilling is back there. I write about him sometimes, as well as Green County Commission and sometimes business.
My name's Rose Barber, and I see some of my students here tonight. I am an adjunct instructor in poli-sci, I teach American government. That's kind of my evening job, and my day job is in the court system for the State Court of Appeals. So because of that job and because of my interest in your open-minded development of critical thinking, I don't have a political point of view tonight, despite my subject area.
All right, my name is Dan Boehlmann. I'm an adjunct instructor in the Department of Communication. My training and background is actually in political communication and campaigns. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from.
My name is Nathan Cassidy, and I'm a full-time communication instructor. And I have a degree in mass communication with an emphasis in television broadcasting. And I teach the COM 150 Introduction to Mass Media course here on campus. So we look at the history of all sorts of different types of media.
And I'm Steve Koehler. I teach the journalism class here at OTC online. I've been teaching it both seated and online for about 11 years. Prior to that, probably currently too if I do freelance work, I've been in journalism for 45 years, and I've seen it take a lot of changes, a lot of turns. And we're here tonight to discuss some of those changes and turns, some for the better and some for the worse. But it will be a lively discussion, I'm sure.
Thank you. And I was thinking about this when I was set up to start this panel. How exactly do you begin a conversation about fake news? And unfortunately, the news itself told me over the last week we had a tragic shooting with 11 dead in Pittsburgh at a synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I bring that up because you could argue to a certain extent that fake news was at least partially responsible for this shooting. I forget the shooter's name, and personally I don't even want to, wish I never knew in the first place. But the shooter himself argued on Gab. You ever heard of Gab? Gab is like the politically incorrect, which is the ridiculously kind way of referring, version of Twitter. And he said several times that he had learned over the course of his most recent days that Jewish people were ushering in illegal immigrants into America so that they could eventually take over the white race, or whatever version of events he had described. Now this has some backing in fake news. Very recently, like within a couple weeks ago, there's a caravan heading up Mexico right now with about 3,000 immigrants headed towards America. And it was reported on Fox News by a guy named Chris Farrell of Judicial Watch. And he went on Fox News and he called this caravan, he described it as being funded by George Soros and the State Department. Now this is extremely controversial. George Soros is a billionaire who happens to be Jewish. And there's no evidence for that being the case. And yet it was aired on Fox News uncritically on Lou Dobbs's, faced no criticism on Lou Dobbs's own show. So fake news is another one of these aspects of our life that creates tangible impacts in how we deal with one another. Usually it's how we deal with each other interpersonally, but sometimes it's how we deal with each other under more consequential circumstances. So I want to throw it to the panel because, again, this is a very loaded term. Dan, can I start with you? The most basic question of all. What is fake news?
Okay, so I think we can take a couple of different time horizons and look at it in different ways. We could argue that fake news has been around since the, and I'm not going to get all of the dates right, but since the 1800s when we had newspapers were party presses and were not, what we would think of as fact-based or necessarily fact-based organizations. Honestly, nowadays, when I hear the term fake news, what I think of is people saying, all right, this information challenges my preconceptions and how I see the world and what I understand to be my truth, so I'm going to call it fake. Basically, to me, nowadays, I see fake news as a rejection of objective truth, of the idea that there is some objective reality outside of the socially constructed.
Steve, what's fake news?
Well, we talked about this before, but I don't even accept the term fake news because it's an oxymoron. If it's fake, it can't be news because news has to contain information that's accurate, truthful, and informative. And if it's fake, then it can't be news. So that term should just be erased. It's been picked up lately because the administration likes to use that when attacking stories, for the most part, that they don't agree with. I know when I used to write stories, my sources didn't want me to use both sides. They wanted me to just use one side. And when you use the other side, they said, well, you're being unfair. And I think that's what we're finding with the administration is that they haven't been treated by the media like this before, when they came from New York and their real estate dealings, they could pretty much manipulate the media the way they wanted to. If they wanted a magazine story, they would call up from New Yorker, or they call up Cindy Smith, or one of the gossip columnists. But now they're having to deal with a very adversarial news media group that is there for the intent to call the government on the carpet. The media is there for the governed and not the government. So they're doing their job to bring to light things that may be questionable. And the administration doesn't like that. They want it all to be, everybody be in lockstep and report things the way they want it.
Steve, Chris Farrell goes on television and he says the caravan is being funded by George Soros.
Right.
That is fake news, true or
No,
false?
that's a lie. That's just incorrect. You don't need to call it fake news. You just say, that's incorrect. It has no source, it has no basis, has no credibility. If Alissa wrote a story, that story, we wouldn't call it fake news, we'd call it, it's incorrect. You gotta correct that. Somebody would call her and say, if it would happen on a local level, say somebody's saying they're paying for the Christmas parade with city funds, and she wrote a story that said that, well, somebody's gonna call her to say, prove it, or hopefully she will have the proof in the story.
Rose, I got to admit, I've never heard the phrase, I guess maybe I've heard it, I just didn't care about the phrase fake news until about 3 years ago.
3 years ago.
Does that mean fake news is new?
No, of course not. I mean, in fact, what we used to hear, and then kind of fell silent, but the term we used to hear was propaganda. That someone was using propaganda, basically information to persuade you a certain way. And eventually that word kind of took on a broader meaning to mean false information to persuade you.
Fiction.
Yeah, fiction. And we used to think that only the governments that were not great governments looking around the world would succumb to propaganda. So even there, you got to be careful about the word. Are we talking about just information to sway you, or information to use, or false information to sway you? Either way, you kind of, as the listener, the reader, the observer, still have the same burden to check it out. So whether you think your source is the government, or a reporter, or your poli-sci teacher, question it.
There's an old journalism adage, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. And that's kind of what we, even then. So, yeah, you really have to be vigilant, especially nowadays with the flood of information, both correct and incorrect, that's on the internet. You really have to be careful and use a lot of filters and use a lot of sources before you come to a judgment on whether this news is accurate or not.
I would like to object to the part where you say you should question your political science teacher. I like being taken as gospel. That is what I just said is fake news. Alissa, from your perspective, fake news has to be more than just propaganda. Can't fake news also mean, as many people like to use it, when you have a biased point of view and you're reporting things from a biased point of view? Is that fake news as you conceive of it?
Opinion. I think, so the primary question that was asked tonight was, what is fake news? I think it's important to draw a distinction between what, like, for lack of a better term, I just call actual fake news, which is a news article that, or it looks like a news article that's has deliberately false information disseminated to, I don't know, either help someone or hurt someone. And then there's the weaponized term fake news used by people to try to discredit legitimate news sources. And then I think these like commentators or political analysts, they might make up a separate third category that's, they talk about their own opinions, but maybe presented as the news. And I think that is up to each one of us to carefully analyze and critically think about before we accept it as true as well.
Steve, what are the roots of fake news?
Well, I'm researching it. You go back to the Romans, and the Romans fed the Christians to the lions because they told everybody they were children of Satan, and that's the reason they need to be eaten by lions. So it goes way, way back. But I think the origin of it is always been there, and we've been guilty of it ourselves. There's a couple of famous episodes in journalism with Janet Cook and Jason's last name.
Jason Blair.
Blair, yeah. Who actually faked stories, got them published in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And Janet Cook, she wrote about a drug-addicted teen, never existed, never happened. She won a Pulitzer Prize. They had to pull the Pulitzer Prize back. So we're guilty of it too. Sometimes Stephen Glass, if anybody's ever seen the film Shattered Glass, that's all about a guy who wrote for the New Republic, and he faked dozens and dozens of stories and got them by editors. So we're almost as guilty of that as anyone. But there's always been people trying to get their side, their opinion into these stories. Our columnists who are writing because they've been given, you know, some kind of money or payoff to write a certain way, or they're actually secretly working for people. So we're just as guilty of it, but we need to police it more, and we have tried to police it as best we can.
What you just described there, though, that's incompetence, isn't it?
Sure.
Incompetent editing.
Yeah.
That's different than maliciously trying to mislead somebody.
Well, no, Janet Cook and Jason deliberately tried to misguide people with these stories that somehow got published. So they had the intent of, they weren't going to do any reporting. They were just going to try and win a prize. So they wrote these stories, and they were so compelling that Janet Cook actually won that story. So yeah, there's a lot of incompetence going around, but the idea of fake news is just a new term. It's always been there one way or the other. We run corrections, or I always say we do that. I feel like I'm still working for the paper. We run corrections every day just about. Because we're not perfect, we're humans. We make mistakes, and we own up to those. But you see where the administration never owns up to any mistake they might have made, be it a statistic or a quote or anything like that. So there's no ownership of being responsible for what you said or published or written.
So Dan, I take a couple points, Nathan, I take a couple points here that Dan raised. One point that Dan raises is that oftentimes we conflate fake news with our own desire to not believe news that may actually be true. And I also take Steve's point where he says fake news is a misnomer. In reality, we're just putting a new name on lies. I am sympathetic to both those points. But when I think of fake news, I think the term fake news, what I think is stuff like Occupy Democrats and stuff like Breitbart. And these are outlets that are not necessarily incompetent. They know what they're doing, and they're actively misleading. Does that intent play a role in defining fake news in your mind or not, Nathan?
I think it does. I mean, you know, when you look at news websites like Breitbart and Occupy Democrats, they obviously have a slant to them. They obviously have far right or a far left slant, and they know what they're doing. I've read some sources that say it's, you know, it is in fact fake news. They're putting out misleading information or incorrect or wrong information or because of intent. And again, I think one of the things it goes back to is the burden of figuring out whether or not this is true. It goes back to the readers. Can they verify what they are reading? Can they go to 2 or 3 other sources and find the same claims and observations, or are you getting contradictory information? And going back and looking at the origin of the sources themselves, I would agree with Steve that it has been going on for, I mean, we just started learning about the term fake news really 3 years ago, the actual term fake news. But, you know, examples with propaganda, satirical news websites also, which I guess some consider to be fake news as well, like The Onion and WRP, which are a couple of other satirical news sites. You can even make a case where you can throw that into the fake news category as well.
Rose, when something is called fake news, and I'm sorry to hammer this point home, but we got to make sure we understand the topic. Should intent play a role, or just the inaccuracy play a role in what constitutes, in the public's opinion, as fake news?
You know, I would go beyond intent, because the impact.
What do you mean beyond intent?
Well, let's say someone is just incompetent and they put a story out there that they just they weren't trying to win a Pulitzer by writing a novel turned into, you know, reporting, but they